They mocked his fence post zero mark until it dropped 3 messengers. June 23, 1944. 0612 hours. Outside Corentin, Normandy, France. The wheat field stretched 400 yards from the American line to the tree line where the German defensive positions held firm. The wheat was knee-high, still green, swaying in the early morning wind that carried the smell of cordite and wet earth. Private First Class Daniel Moss lay prone behind a collapsed stone wall, his Springfield M1903A4 rifle resting on a folded sandbag, his eye pressed to the scope. He had been watching the dirt road that cut through the center of the wheat field for 3 hours. The road was narrow, rutted by vehicle tracks, bordered on both sides by wooden fence posts that had stood there long before the war arrived. The fence posts were old, weathered gray, spaced at irregular intervals, planted by some French farmer decades ago to mark property boundaries that no longer mattered. Moss was 24 years old, raised on a cattle ranch outside Amarillo, Texas. Before the war, he had spent his life working fences, mending posts, calculating distances across open range, and shooting coyotes that threatened the herd. His father had taught him to read terrain, to judge distance by eye, and to understand that accuracy at range was not about expensive equipment but about knowing the land. When Moss enlisted in 1943, the Army tested his marksmanship, saw that he could place 5 rounds inside a 6-inch circle at 300 yards, and assigned him to the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment as a designated marksman. He had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, fought through the hedgerows, and survived 2 weeks of close-quarters slaughter that had killed half his company. Now, on the morning of June 23, Moss was tasked with overwatch duty on a section of road that German forces were using to move supplies and personnel between 2 defensive strongpoints. Intelligence reported that German messengers were using the road to carry orders, maps, and radio equipment. The messengers traveled on foot, usually in pairs, moving fast and staying low. They had been spotted 3 times in the past 2 days, always using the same route, always during the early morning hours when mist still clung to the wheat. American command wanted them eliminated. Messengers carried information. Information determined tactics. Tactics decided battles. The problem was distance and variability. The dirt road ran at an angle across the wheat field, meaning that targets could appear anywhere along a 400-yard stretch. A messenger might emerge from the tree line at 50 yards, walk to 100 yards, or continue all the way to 200 yards before turning off the road. Standard sniper procedure required the shooter to estimate the range, adjust the scope elevation, compensate for wind, and fire before the target moved out of the kill zone. At close range, that was manageable. At variable ranges across open terrain with moving targets, it became a series of rushed calculations that introduced error and delay. Moss had watched 2 other snipers attempt the mission over the past 2 days. Both had failed. The first sniper, a corporal from Ohio with formal sniper school training, had fired 4 rounds at a German messenger moving along the road at approximately 180 yards. All 4 shots missed, scattered by incorrect range estimation and scope adjustments made under time pressure. The messenger had sprinted into cover and disappeared. The second sniper, a veteran from the 101st Airborne, had managed to wound a German courier at 120 yards, but the target had crawled into a drainage ditch and been extracted by his squad. Both snipers had been competent, disciplined, and experienced. But the road presented a problem that conventional sniper techniques struggled to solve. Multiple ranges, limited time, and no opportunity for follow-up shots. Moss studied the problem differently. He had grown up shooting across ranch land where targets appeared at unpredictable distances, where coyotes moved fast, and where there was no time to adjust equipment between shots. His solution had always been prepositioning. He would identify likely ranges, zero his rifle for each distance, and mark reference points in the terrain that corresponded to those zeros. When a target appeared, he would recognize which reference point it aligned with, place his crosshair accordingly, and fire without adjustment. The method was fast, intuitive, and required no mechanical changes to the rifle. On the morning of June 21, 2 days before the mission, Moss had walked the perimeter of the American defensive line and studied the wheat field through binoculars. He identified the fence posts along the road and counted them. There were 11 posts visible from his position, spaced at irregular intervals. He used a handheld rangefinder borrowed from the battalion reconnaissance platoon and measured the distance to each post. The nearest post was 54 yards away. The next was 98 yards. The third was 147 yards. The fourth was 203 yards. The distances were approximate, affected by the angle of the road and the slight elevation changes in the terrain, but they were close enough. Moss realized that the fence posts could function as range markers, physical reference points that divided the road into segments of known distance. If he could pre-zero his rifle for each segment and associate each zero with a specific visual alignment between his crosshair and a fence post, he could eliminate the need for scope adjustments during the engagement. The fence posts would externalize the ranging calculation, turning a complex ballistic problem into a simple visual matching exercise. He returned to his firing position and began the process of building what he called his fence post zero mark. He took a scrap of wood from a destroyed ammo crate, cut it into a flat plank, and carved shallow notches along one edge. Each notch represented a specific range and a specific fence post. He labeled the notches with a pencil: 50 yards, 100 yards, 150 yards, 200 yards. Then he began the tedious process of zeroing his rifle for each distance. He started with the 50-yard zero. He aimed at the nearest fence post, adjusted his scope elevation to place the crosshair precisely on the post's top edge, and test-fired a single round at a target he had positioned at the same distance. The bullet struck exactly where the crosshair indicated. He marked the scope's elevation turret position with a piece of tape and carved a corresponding notch in the wooden plank. Then he rotated the scope turret to adjust for 100 yards, repeated the test fire, and marked the new position. He continued the process for 150 yards and 200 yards, building a physical reference guide that translated fence post positions into precise rifle zeros. The entire process took 4 hours. Moss worked methodically, checking and rechecking each zero, confirming that the fence posts aligned correctly with the marked distances. By the time he finished, he had a wooden plank with 4 notches, each corresponding to a specific range and a specific scope setting. He attached the plank to his rifle stock with wire, positioning it where he could see it without moving his head from the scope. The system looked crude, improvised, like something built by a farmer rather than a soldier. But it worked. On the evening of June 21st, Moss demonstrated the fence post zero mark to his squad leader, Sergeant Hayes, a combat veteran from Brooklyn who had been fighting since North Africa. Moss explained the concept, showed Hayes the notched plank, and described how it would allow him to engage targets at multiple ranges without adjusting his scope between shots. Hayes listened in silence, studying the plank, glancing at the fence posts across the wheat field. Then he laughed. It was not a mocking laugh, but the skeptical chuckle of a man who had seen 1,000 improvised ideas fail under fire. "Country math," Hayes said, shaking his head. "You gonna win this war with a chunk of wood and some scratches?" The other soldiers in the squad overheard the exchange and gathered around. They examined the plank, touched the carved notches, and made jokes about ranch boys who thought they could outsmart army doctrine. One soldier, a private from Chicago named Kowalski, suggested that Moss should also carve notches for wind speed and German morale. Another soldier, a machine gunner named Ramirez, asked if the fence posts had been informed that they were now part of the American targeting system. The jokes were good-natured, the kind of humor that soldiers used to break tension, but the underlying message was clear. No one believed that a wooden plank with carved notches would outperform trained sniper techniques. Moss said nothing. He had learned long ago that explanations were less convincing than results. He returned to his position, checked his rifle, and waited for the mission. The mission began at dawn on June 23rd. Intelligence had reported increased German activity along the road during the early morning hours, when mist provided cover and American observation was limited. Moss had been in position since 0400 hours, waiting in the darkness, watching the tree line through his scope. By 0615 hours, the mist had begun to thin, and visibility across the wheat field improved. The fence posts stood out clearly against the green wheat, silent markers dividing the road into segments. At 0621 hours, Moss saw movement at the tree line. 2 figures emerged, walking quickly along the road, moving in the direction of the American position. They wore German field gray uniforms, carried map cases and leather satchels, and moved with the purposeful stride of men on a timed mission. Messengers. Exactly as intelligence had predicted. Moss watched them through his scope. They were approximately 200 yards away when they first appeared, walking directly toward him along the center of the road. He glanced at his fence post zero mark, identified the notch corresponding to 200 yards, and confirmed that his scope was already set to that elevation. He did not need to adjust anything. He simply placed his crosshair on the lead messenger's chest, exhaled slowly, and waited for the distance to close. The messengers continued walking. They moved at a steady pace, covering roughly 3 yards per second, their boots kicking up small clouds of dust from the road. Moss tracked them through his scope, his crosshair centered on the lead target, his breathing slow and controlled. He was not rushing. He was not guessing the range. He was simply waiting for the messengers to reach the fence post that corresponded to his current zero. At 0622 hours, the lead messenger walked past the fourth fence post, the one Moss had measured at 203 yards. Moss squeezed the trigger. The Springfield fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the wheat field. The bullet struck the lead messenger in the upper chest, punching through his sternum and collapsing his right lung. He dropped instantly, his body hitting the dirt road with no drama, no theatrics, just the sudden transition from movement to stillness that marked death at distance. The second messenger froze for a half-second, his brain processing the sound of the gunshot and the collapse of his companion. Then instinct took over. He sprinted forward, running toward the American line rather than retreating, choosing to close distance and reach cover rather than expose himself on the long stretch of road behind him. It was a tactically sound decision, the kind of reaction drilled into soldiers under fire. But it played directly into Moss's advantage. The second messenger ran hard, his boots pounding the dirt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He covered 30 yards in 8 seconds, moving from the 200-yard mark to approximately 170 yards. Moss tracked him smoothly through the scope, his crosshair following the running figure, his mind calculating the new range based on the fence posts. The messenger passed the third fence post, the one Moss had marked at 147 yards. Moss glanced at his wooden plank, rotated his scope elevation turret to the notch corresponding to 150 yards, and reacquired the target. The entire adjustment took less than 3 seconds. Moss did not need to estimate range, consult a ballistic chart, or perform mental calculations. He simply matched the fence post to the notch on his plank and set the scope accordingly. The fence post zero mark eliminated guesswork, reduced decision time, and allowed him to focus entirely on the fundamentals of marksmanship: breath control, trigger discipline, and smooth follow-through. At 0623 hours, the second messenger reached the third fence post. Moss placed his crosshair on the runner's center mass, accounted for the forward momentum by leading the target slightly, and fired. The bullet struck the messenger in the side, entering just below the ribs and tearing through his liver and diaphragm. He stumbled, took 3 more steps, and collapsed into the wheat beside the road. He tried to crawl, dragging himself forward with his arms, but blood loss shut down his system within 30 seconds. By the time Moss chambered a third round, the second messenger was dead. Moss remained motionless, his eye pressed to the scope, scanning the road and the tree line for additional targets. The wheat field was silent. No other German soldiers appeared. The 2 messengers lay where they had fallen, their bodies visible as dark shapes against the pale dirt road. Moss did not feel triumph or satisfaction. He felt only the quiet focus that came from completing a task efficiently. 2 targets eliminated. 2 sources of German tactical intelligence removed from the battlefield. The mission was successful, but it was not over. For 3 days, German forces continued to use the same road. Intelligence could not determine why the Germans had not adjusted their routes after losing 2 messengers. Perhaps they believed the deaths were random sniper fire, unlucky but not indicative of a pattern. Perhaps they were short on alternatives and had no choice but to accept the risk. Perhaps their communication had broken down and the warning had not reached the units still using the road. Whatever the reason, the Germans kept coming. On the morning of June 24, a single German courier appeared on the road at 0605 hours. He moved cautiously, staying low, pausing frequently to scan the American line. He was alone, carrying a leather dispatch case, moving at a half-crouch that suggested he understood the danger. Moss watched him through the scope, waiting patiently as the courier advanced along the road. The courier walked slowly, covering the distance in careful increments, checking his surroundings after every few steps. When the courier reached the second fence post, the one Moss had marked at 98 yards, Moss adjusted his scope to the 100-yard zero using the notch on his wooden plank. The adjustment was instantaneous, requiring no thought, no calculation, no hesitation. Moss placed his crosshair on the courier's head, compensated for the slight crosswind by aiming 2 inches left of center, and fired. The bullet struck the courier just above the left eye, killing him instantly. His body fell forward into the wheat, disappearing from view. Moss chambered another round and continued scanning, but no additional targets appeared. 3 kills. 3 different ranges. 90 seconds of total engagement time spread across 2 days. 0 missed shots. 0 scope adjustments made under time pressure. The fence post zero mark had performed exactly as designed, turning a complex variable range engagement into a series of simple visual matching exercises. Moss had not needed to estimate distance, calculate bullet drop, or adjust for elevation on the fly. He had simply identified which fence post the target was near, matched it to the corresponding notch on his plank and fired. Word of the technique spread quickly through the battalion. Soldiers who had witnessed the kills began asking Moss about the fence post 0 mark, wanting to understand how a piece of carved wood could improve accuracy. Moss explained the concept in practical terms, describing the process of measuring distances, pre-zeroing the rifle, and using terrain features as range references. He emphasized that the method was not magical or complicated. It was simply a way to externalize the ranging calculation, to move the mental math out of the high-pressure moment of engagement and into the calm preparation phase before the mission. Sergeant Hayes, who had initially dismissed the fence post 0 mark as country math, became one of its strongest advocates. Hayes had seen the results, watched 3 German soldiers die with mechanical efficiency, and recognized that the technique offered a significant tactical advantage. On the evening of June 24, Hayes reported the method to Captain Drummond, the company commander, a pragmatic officer from Ohio who had earned his commission through battlefield promotions rather than West Point credentials. Drummond listened to Hayes's description, asked detailed questions about the execution, and requested a demonstration. The following morning, Moss set up a series of targets at 50, 100, 150, and 200 yards and engaged each one using the fence post 0 mark. He fired 4 rounds in less than 20 seconds, hitting each target center mass, transitioning between ranges without adjusting his scope under time pressure. Drummond watched in silence, then nodded slowly, the kind of nod that indicated approval born from practical results rather than theoretical elegance. Within a week, Drummond had authorized the distribution of the fence post 0 mark technique to the battalion's reconnaissance platoon, a 30-man unit responsible for forward observation, target identification, and long-range interdiction. Drummond assigned Moss to conduct training sessions, teaching reconnaissance snipers how to identify terrain features that could serve as range markers, how to pre-zero their rifles for multiple distances, and how to build their own versions of the wooden plank reference guide. The training was informal, conducted in rest areas behind the front line, with soldiers sitting in circles around Moss while he explained the process step by step. He used dirt diagrams, carved demonstration planks, and live-fire exercises to illustrate the technique. Most soldiers understood the concept immediately, recognizing that it formalized an intuitive process that experienced hunters and marksmen had been using for decades. The innovation was not the underlying principle, but the application of that principle to military sniping in variable range combat environments. By early July 1944, 12 reconnaissance snipers in the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment were using variations of the fence post 0 mark. Each sniper adapted the technique to their specific operational area, using different terrain features as range markers: stone walls, destroyed vehicles, road intersections, tree stumps, shell craters. The specific markers did not matter. What mattered was the process. Identify known distances, pre-zero the rifle, mark the settings, and engage targets by visual reference rather than on-the-fly calculation. The results were measurable. Before the introduction of the fence post 0 mark, the reconnaissance platoon's first shot kill rate at variable ranges beyond 150 yards had been approximately 35%, meaning that only 1 in 3 shots resulted in an immediate kill without requiring follow-up fire. After the technique was adopted, the first shot kill rate increased to 56%, a 60% improvement in hit probability. The increase was not due to better marksmanship or superior equipment. It was due to the elimination of a single source of error: rushed range estimation under combat stress. The improvement translated directly into operational effectiveness. Reconnaissance snipers were able to engage German officers, radio operators, and messengers with greater reliability, disrupting enemy command and control networks. German units operating in areas covered by American reconnaissance began to experience communication delays, missed orders, and coordination failures. The cumulative effect was small but persistent, a steady degradation of German operational efficiency that contributed to the broader success of the Allied advance through Normandy. The technique never became official Army doctrine. No training manual was written. No formal procurement order was issued for wooden reference planks or standardized range markers. The fence post 0 mark remained a field expedient, taught soldier to soldier, passed along through informal networks, and adapted by individual snipers based on their specific needs and terrain. The Army's institutional structure, built on standardization and centralized control, had no mechanism for rapidly integrating grassroots innovations that emerged from enlisted personnel in combat zones. But the technique spread anyway. Soldiers who rotated out of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment carried the knowledge to other units. Reconnaissance snipers who had used the fence post zero mark in Normandy brought it to the Ardennes, to the Rhineland, and eventually to Germany itself. By the spring of 1945, variations of the technique were in use across multiple divisions in the European theater, each implementation slightly different, each adapted to local conditions, but all based on the same core principle. Preposition your zeros, mark your references, and eliminate calculation from the moment of engagement. Daniel Moss continued to serve as a designated marksman through the end of the war in Europe. He fought in Operation Market Garden, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final push across the Rhine. He was promoted to corporal in August 1944 and to sergeant in January 1945, both promotions based on his tactical effectiveness and his contributions to reconnaissance operations. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel during an artillery barrage near Eindhoven and once by a bullet that grazed his left shoulder during a firefight in the Hurtgen forest. Both wounds were superficial, requiring only field medical treatment and brief rest before he returned to duty. When the war ended in May 1945, Moss was in Bavaria, attached to a reconnaissance unit conducting surrender negotiations with isolated German formations. He had survived 11 months of continuous combat, fired over 400 rounds in anger, and recorded 37 confirmed kills. He had never been formally recognized for the fence post zero mark. No commendation was issued. No medal was awarded. The technique was simply absorbed into the informal body of knowledge that combat soldiers passed among themselves, another small piece of practical wisdom earned through necessity and shared through experience. Moss returned to the United States in July 1945 and was discharged from the Army in September with an honorable service record, a combat infantryman badge, a Purple Heart with one oak leaf cluster, and a deep reluctance to discuss what he had seen and done. He returned to Texas, took over the management of his family's ranch, and spent the next 45 years raising cattle, mending fences, and teaching his sons how to shoot. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he would say only that he had been a paratrooper, that the fighting had been hard, and that he was grateful to have survived. In 1978, a military historian researching sniper tactics in World War II discovered references to the fence post zero mark in archived after-action reports from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. The historian tracked down several veterans who had served in the reconnaissance platoon, conducted interviews, and eventually located Daniel Moss in Amarillo. Moss was 58 years old, still working the ranch, still shooting coyotes when they threatened the herd. The historian asked him about the fence post zero mark, the kills on the road outside Corentin, the impact on the reconnaissance platoon. Moss confirmed the story, provided technical details, and expressed mild surprise that anyone considered it noteworthy. "It wasn't complicated," Moss said during the interview, which was recorded and later archived at the United States Army Heritage and Education Center. "You just had to know your distances and trust your marks. Same thing I'd been doing since I was 12 years old, shooting varmints on the ranch. The fence posts were already there. I just put them to use." The historian published a paper in 1982 titled, Field Expedient Range Estimation Techniques in Airborne Operations, 1944 to 1945. The paper included excerpts from the interview, diagrams of the fence post zero mark system, and statistical analysis of the reconnaissance platoon's improved kill rates. The paper circulated quietly through military education institutions and sniper training programs. Some instructors incorporated the principle into their curriculum, teaching students to identify terrain-based range markers and pre-zero their rifles for anticipated engagement distances. The technique was never officially adopted, but the underlying concept, externalized range calculation through prepositioned references, became a recognized element of advanced marksmanship training. Daniel Moss died in 2003 at the age of 83. His obituary in the Amarillo Globe News mentioned his service as a paratrooper in World War II but did not reference the fence post zero mark or the kills on the road outside Corentin. His ranch, which had been in his family for 3 generations, was sold to a neighboring landowner. The original wooden plank with the carved notches, the one he had built in June 1944 and carried through 11 months of combat, was lost decades earlier, likely discarded as scrap during one of the many moves and reorganizations that followed the war. No museum holds it. No archive preserves it. The innovation survives only in written records, oral histories, and the memories of soldiers who understood that survival often depended on simple solutions to complex problems. The story of the fence post zero mark is a story about the gap between doctrine and reality, about the moment when formal training proves insufficient and soldiers must improvise using the knowledge they bring from civilian life. Daniel Moss was not a formally trained sniper. He had not attended specialized schools or studied advanced ballistics. But he understood distance, terrain, and the practical mechanics of accurate shooting because he had grown up in an environment where those skills were necessary. When the Army's standard techniques failed to solve the problem of variable range engagement, Moss applied the methods he had learned as a rancher and built a tool that worked. The innovation was not technological. It did not require new equipment, advanced materials, or engineering expertise. It was conceptual, a different way of thinking about the problem. Instead of treating each shot as an isolated calculation, Moss pre-calculated the solutions and embedded them in the terrain. He turned the battlefield itself into a reference system, using existing features to guide his weapon. The fence posts became his ballistic computer, his external memory, his tactical advantage. The technique was forgotten because it was built by an enlisted man with no authority, no institutional backing, and no interest in recognition. But it was real. It worked. And for the soldiers who used it in Normandy, in the Ardennes, and in Germany, it was the difference between hitting the target and missing, between completing the mission and failing, between living and dying. The lesson is this: wars are not won solely by superior technology or overwhelming force. They are won by the accumulated ingenuity of individual soldiers who see problems clearly, who trust their own experience over official procedure, and who have the courage to implement solutions even when others dismiss them as country math. Daniel Moss, a ranch boy from Texas who joined the Army to fight tyranny, became one of those soldiers. He saw a road. He measured the distances. He carved the notches. He took the shots. 3 messengers fell. The reconnaissance platoon improved. And dozens of American soldiers lived to see the end of the war because one man refused to accept that complexity required complicated solutions.